The cargo bay was a fortress of shadows and silence, a labyrinth of steel and secrecy designed to conceal its sinister purpose. Ethan stalked through the oppressive darkness, his blaster holstered but ready. The air hung thick with the faint metallic tang of fuel and the bitter undertones of fear, a scent that lingered in places like this. He moved swiftly, his boots barely making a sound on the cold floor. Smugglers like him didn't survive long by being loud or by asking questions. The mission was simple: slip aboard the freighter, locate the contraband, and get out before anyone realized what he'd taken. Ethan had done jobs like this countless times, and each one had chipped away a little more of his soul. Tonight, though, something felt wrong. His instincts, honed by years of living on the fringes of legality, whispered warnings he couldn't quite shake. A faint noise stopped him in his tracks, chains rattling against steel. Ethan's jaw tightened. He knew better than to let curiosity distract him, but his feet moved anyway, pulling him toward the sound. A faint greenish glow leaked through the cracks of a nearby container, illuminating the grime-streaked walls in ghostly hues. He hesitated, fingers hovering over the control pad that sealed the crate. The ship's cargo manifest hadn't mentioned living beings, and he had no intention of walking into a mess he couldn't handle. Yet, something about the light, the eerie, pulsing quality of it called to him. He keyed in an override, his hacking tool whirring faintly. The lock disengaged with a soft hiss, and the door slid open. Inside, a woman sat slumped against the wall, her luminous green skin glowing faintly in the dim light. Her head snapped up as the door opened, silver eyes locking onto his with a piercing intensity that sent a jolt through his chest. Her wrists and ankles were bound by thick, metallic cuffs, the chains tethered to the walls of the container. She didn't speak. She didn't beg. She just stared, her gaze steady and unyielding, a blend of defiance and quiet suffering. Ethan froze, caught off guard by her alien beauty and the raw emotion emanating from her. Her hair, deep emerald and cascading like a liquid curtain, framed a face that was both otherworldly and hauntingly expressive. A network of glowing veins pulsed faintly beneath her skin, tracing patterns along her arms and neck. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. Her silence stretched, heavy and defiant. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "Does it matter?" Ethan clenched his jaw. He wasn't here for philosophical debates. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his tone softening. Her silver eyes narrowed slightly, as though assessing him. "Not in ways you can see." The answer hit him harder than it should have. Ethan took a step closer, his hand brushing against his blaster. "Look, I don't have time for this. Either you want to get out of here, or you don't." She tilted her head, studying him with a quiet intensity. "And what do you want?" The question caught him off guard. He didn't know the answer, not really. He'd spent years running jobs, stealing what he could to keep his ship running and his past at bay. This wasn't part of the plan. Yet here he was, standing in front of her, unable to turn away. "Stay quiet," he muttered, kneeling to unlock her restraints. The chains clattered to the ground, and she rubbed her wrists, her movements slow and deliberate, as though testing the limits of her newfound freedom. Ethan stood, his gaze never leaving her. "Can you walk?" "Yes," she said simply. She rose to her feet, her movements graceful despite her exhaustion. She was taller than he'd expected, her presence commanding even in her weakened state. "Follow me," he said, his tone brisk. He turned and began moving toward the ship's exit, expecting her to lag behind. Instead, she kept pace with him, her steps light and purposeful. The alarm started as they reached the docking bay. A harsh, grating wail echoed through the ship, signaling a breach. Ethan swore under his breath. He quickened his pace. Kira, he still didn't know her name, matching him stride for stride. "Who's after you?" he asked, his voice clipped. "Everyone," she replied, her tone neutral. "Great," he muttered. "That makes two of us." They reached the Raven, his battered, rust-colored freighter, just as a group of armed guards rounded the corner. Ethan fired off 2 quick shots, his aim precise. The guards fell, but the noise would draw more. Inside, he barked, motioning for her to climb the loading ramp. She obeyed without hesitation, her glowing veins casting an eerie light on the ship's dull interior. Ethan followed, slamming the ramp shut behind them and locking it with a series of quick commands. He bolted for the cockpit, sliding into the pilot's seat and flipping a series of switches. The engines roared to life, the ship trembling as it lifted off. Through the viewport, he saw the freighter's hangar growing smaller, the void of space swallowing them whole. When they were safely away, Ethan leaned back in his seat, exhaling deeply. He turned to face her. She stood near the cockpit entrance, her eyes scanning the room with quiet curiosity. "You've got a name?" he asked. "Kira," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was a wariness to it, as though she was testing his intentions. "Kira," he repeated. "I'm Ethan. Welcome to my ship. Don't touch anything." Her lips twitched, the barest hint of a smile. Charming. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I don't know what you're mixed up in, but you're free now. I'll drop you off somewhere safe, and you can figure out the rest." She tilted her head, her silver eyes narrowing slightly. "Free," she said, as though tasting the word for the first time. "What does that mean?" "It means you can go wherever you want, do whatever you want," Ethan said, his tone gruff. "You're not my problem anymore." Her gaze didn't waver. "And if I don't want to leave?" Ethan stared at her, caught off guard by the simplicity of her question. He didn't have an answer. For the first time in years, he felt like he'd stepped into a situation he couldn't just shoot or talk his way out of. "Clean yourself up," he said finally, nodding toward the corridor. "There's a cabin down the hall. It's yours. For now." She nodded once and turned to leave. As she walked away, her glowing veins pulsing faintly in the dim light, Ethan felt the weight of his choice settle heavily on his shoulders. He didn't know who Kira was, but something told him his life had just become infinitely more complicated. Ethan piloted the Raven through the vast expanse of space, the stars streaking past like glowing threads in a tapestry of darkness. His fingers moved over the console with practiced ease, though his mind churned with unease. Kira sat silently in the co-pilot's seat, her luminous skin casting a faint green hue across the cockpit. She stared out the viewport, her silver eyes unblinking, as if trying to absorb the enormity of her new reality. He had expected her to collapse into exhaustion or to pepper him with questions about her situation. Instead, she sat with a calm that unsettled him, her silence speaking louder than words. "Ever been on a ship before?" he asked, breaking the tension. She turned her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Not like this." "What does that mean?" Kira's gaze returned to the stars. "I've traveled before, but not as cargo." Her words struck him like a physical blow. Ethan clenched the armrest of his chair, fighting the urge to ask more. He wasn't sure he wanted to know the details of what she had endured, and he doubted she wanted to relive them. Instead, he focused on the task at hand. "We're heading to Teros. It's quiet, out of the way. You'll be safe there." She shifted, crossing her arms over her chest. "And what happens when we get there?" "You're free to go," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "I'll give you some credits, point you towards someone who can help you get on your feet." Kira frowned, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You make it sound simple." "It is simple," he said firmly, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. Freedom sounded straightforward in theory, but he knew better than most how messy it could be in practice. When they landed on Teros, the ship's engines whined before powering down, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. The planet's atmosphere glowed faintly blue, its twin moons casting long shadows over the rocky terrain. Ethan led Kira down the loading ramp, gesturing toward a distant cluster of buildings. The settlement sprawled unevenly across the horizon, a patchwork of metal and stone structures built into the craggy cliffs. "Welcome to Teros," he said. "It's not much, but it's off the radar. No one here asks questions they don't want answers to." Kira inhaled deeply, her glowing veins pulsing faintly as her body adjusted to the planet's air. She scanned the landscape, her expression impassive. "It feels different." Ethan frowned. Different how? She hesitated, as if searching for the right words. Less hostile. Like the air isn't watching me. Ethan raised an eyebrow. The air. Kira gave him a faint smile. Figure of speech. They walked into the settlement, drawing a few curious glances but nothing more. Ethan led her to a small cantina tucked into the side of a cliff. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of roasted meat and alien spices. Patrons of various species sat hunched over their drinks, their conversations muted. Ethan motioned for Kira to sit at a corner table. Wait here. As he approached the bar, the bartender, a wiry man with gray streaks in his hair, eyed him warily. Ethan, didn't think I'd see you back here. I need supplies, Ethan said. And some information. The bartender leaned closer. What kind of information? Ethan lowered his voice. Any word on the slave trade in this sector? Shipments, routes, buyers. The bartender's expression darkened. Why are you asking? Let's just say I've gotten involved in something I didn't plan for. The man shook his head. You don't want to get mixed up in that business. It's bigger than you, bigger than all of us. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he nodded. He returned to the table with 2 steaming mugs, setting one in front of Kira. What did you learn? She asked, her silver eyes gleaming with curiosity. Nothing useful, he admitted. But I'll figure it out. Kira studied him, her gaze piercing. Why are you doing this? Doing what? Helping me, she said, her tone direct. You don't know me. You didn't have to save me. Ethan leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. Maybe I didn't like the idea of leaving you there. Maybe I've seen enough people get ground down by this galaxy's uglier side. Does it matter? Her lips curved into a faint smile. It matters. The next few days passed in a strange, tentative rhythm. Kira explored the settlement cautiously, keeping her interactions with others to a minimum. Ethan checked in on her periodically, though he gave her space, unsure how to navigate this new dynamic. One evening, as the twin moons bathed the cliffs in pale light, Kira found him working on the ship's engine. She approached quietly, her bare feet making no sound on the rocky ground. You're good at this, she said, her voice soft. Ethan looked up, wiping grease from his hands. Good at keeping this rust bucket running? It's a survival skill. She tilted her head, studying him. You don't talk about yourself much. There's not much to tell. I don't believe that, she said, sitting on a nearby crate. Everyone has a story. Ethan sighed, leaning against the engine casing. Fine. You want the short version? I grew up on a colony that got wiped out by raiders. I survived, found work on the fringes, did what I had to do to stay alive. End of story. Kira's silver eyes softened. I'm sorry. He shrugged. Don't be. It's ancient history. They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the ship's systems filling the air. Finally, Kira spoke again. You saved me, Ethan. That's part of your story now. Ethan met her gaze, and for the first time he let himself really look at her. She wasn't just some fragile captive. There was a strength in her, a quiet determination that both intrigued and unsettled him. Maybe it is, he said quietly, but I don't know how this story ends. Kira smiled faintly. Neither do I. But I think we're both part of it now. As the days turned into weeks, their uneasy alliance began to shift. Kira's presence became less of an intrusion and more of a quiet comfort. She began to open up about her past, though she kept certain details vague. Ethan found himself drawn to her resilience, her ability to find light in even the darkest corners. But danger loomed closer than either of them realized. Unbeknownst to them, the ship they had escaped from had sent out a distress signal before they left. Someone was already on their trail, and their time on Terras was running out. For now, though, they existed in the fragile space between past and future, two lost souls bound together by chance, or perhaps by something greater. The canyon was eerily silent now, save for the faint whistle of wind scraping against the jagged walls. Ethan scanned the rocky terrain, his blaster still in hand, the tension in his shoulders refusing to ease. 3 attackers lay motionless behind them, but Ethan knew better than to assume the threat had passed. They had been too organized, too determined. Someone had sent them. Beside him, Kira adjusted her makeshift scarf and hood, her luminous skin glowing faintly even in the muted light. Her silver eyes darted between the shadows, her expression calm but alert. "They'll send more," she said, her voice soft yet certain. Ethan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gestured for her to follow as he began climbing the narrow path that led back to the Raven. His thoughts churned, the questions about her powers and her past colliding with his growing frustration at their predicament. He wasn't supposed to care this much. He wasn't supposed to care at all. Kira broke the silence as they walked. "You're angry." Ethan stopped abruptly, turning to face her. "What gave it away? The fact that people keep trying to kill us, or the part where you didn't mention you could fry someone's gun with your bare hands?" Her gaze didn't falter. "I didn't think it mattered." "Didn't matter," Ethan's voice rose, echoing slightly off the canyon walls. "Kira, I've been risking my life for you, and I don't even know what I'm up against. I deserve some answers." Kira stepped closer, her luminous veins pulsing faintly as she held his gaze. "You're right, you do." Her admission surprised him, and his frustration faltered. She lowered her hood, letting the faint glow of her skin illuminate the space between them. "I didn't tell you everything because I don't fully understand it myself. My people like Xalari are sensitive to energy, emotions, electrical currents, even life forces. But after I was taken, they changed me." Ethan frowned. "Changed you how?" "They experimented on us," she said, her voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of pain. "They wanted to amplify our abilities, to turn us into weapons or tools they could control. I don't know how many of us survived, but I know they won't stop until they get me back." Ethan studied her, his jaw tightening. Her words carried a weight he couldn't ignore, and he hated how much it resonated with him. He had seen too much of the galaxy's cruelty to dismiss her story, but it still felt like more than he'd bargained for. "They're not getting you back," he said finally, his voice firm. Kira's expression softened. "You mean that?" "Of course I mean it," he said, his tone sharper than he intended. "I didn't drag you off that ship just to hand you over to those bastards." She stepped closer, her glowing veins casting faint patterns on his face. "Then stop pushing me away." Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "What are you talking about?" "You keep telling me I'm free, that you're helping me, because it's the right thing to do," she said, her voice low and insistent. "But I can feel it, Ethan. I can feel how much you're holding back." He opened his mouth to argue, but the words didn't come. Her silver eyes bore into him, searching for something he wasn't sure he was ready to give. "I'm not a burden," she continued, her voice softening. "I'm not a problem you need to solve. I want to be here with you." Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Kira, this isn't about what I want. It's about keeping you safe." "Safe doesn't mean keeping me at arm's length," she said, stepping closer still. "You saved me, Ethan, not just from them, but from myself. For the first time in years, I feel like I have a choice, and I'm choosing you." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just the glowing alien beauty but the strength and determination that had kept her alive. She wasn't asking for pity or protection. She was asking for trust. Without thinking, he reached out, his hand brushing against her cheek. Her skin was warm, her glowing veins pulsing faintly under his touch. She leaned into his hand, her silver eyes searching his. "I don't know if I can give you what you're asking for," he said quietly. Kira smiled faintly. "Then let me show you." She moved closer, her hand resting lightly on his chest. Ethan's breath hitched as her touch sent a ripple of warmth through him, a sensation that was both foreign and familiar. Slowly she leaned in, her lips brushing against his in a tentative kiss. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The weight of their circumstances, the danger that loomed over them, it all faded, leaving only the two of them. Ethan's arms encircled her, pulling her closer as the kiss deepened. Her glowing veins pulsed brighter, the light reflecting off the canyon walls like a soft, ethereal halo. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing heavily, their foreheads resting against each other. Kira's silver eyes gleamed with a mix of vulnerability and strength, and Ethan felt something inside him shift. "You're stubborn, you know that," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "So are you," she replied, her voice light but filled with emotion. Ethan chuckled softly, his grip on her tightening. "We should get back to the ship. It's only a matter of time before they send more." Kira nodded, but she didn't move immediately. Instead, she pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek before stepping back. "Let's go." The walk back to the Raven was quiet but charged with an unspoken understanding. Ethan's mind raced, the kiss replaying in his thoughts. He hadn't meant to let himself get so close, but now that he had, there was no going back. Kira, for her part, seemed lighter, her steps more assured. She glanced at him occasionally, her silver eyes filled with a quiet confidence that made his chest tighten. As they boarded the ship, Ethan knew one thing for certain: whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. The hum of the Raven's engines reverberated through the cabin like a heartbeat, steady but far from soothing. Ethan leaned over the cockpit console, his hands gripping the edges as he stared at the endless expanse of stars ahead. His mind churned, replaying every moment of their escape, every risk taken, and every question left unanswered. Kira's presence was magnetic, undeniable. He had saved her, yes, but now, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was saving him, too, in ways he couldn't yet understand. That terrified him more than the bounty hunters on their trail. "You're brooding again," Kira said from the doorway, her voice breaking the stillness. Ethan turned to see her leaning casually against the frame. Her luminous green skin glowed faintly in the dim light, casting her features in soft shadows. She had changed into a loose, sleeveless tunic and dark trousers, her silver eyes sharp but weary. Despite everything, she carried herself with a calm defiance that both infuriated and inspired him. "Thinking," Ethan corrected, straightening up. "Brooding sounds too dramatic." Kira stepped into the cockpit, her bare feet silent against the metal floor. "You always think with that much tension in your shoulders." Ethan smirked, despite himself. "You're observant." She crossed her arms, tilting her head. "You make it easy." Ethan's smirk faded. "I'm just trying to figure out how we're still alive." Kira sat in the co-pilot's seat, her movements deliberate. "We're alive because we work together. You should stop beating yourself up for doing something right." Ethan snorted, sinking into his seat. "Right isn't usually what I aim for. Survival's easier." Kira's expression softened, but her gaze stayed intense. "Survival isn't living, Ethan." The words struck harder than he cared to admit. He opened his mouth to reply, but the ship's console suddenly lit up with flashing red warnings. A sharp alarm followed, cutting through the quiet. Ethan leaned forward, his hands flying over the controls. "Proximity alert. Someone's tracking us." "How?" Kira asked, her voice sharpening. "Must have tagged us during the ambush," Ethan said grimly. He brought up the ship's rear cameras, and his heart sank. A sleek black vessel loomed in the distance, its angular design bristling with weaponry. "Looks familiar," Kira murmured, her glowing veins pulsing faintly. "Who are they?" Ethan scowled. "Doesn't matter. They're not here to negotiate." As if on cue, the comm system crackled to life, and a voice, smooth and cold, filled the cockpit. "Ethan Ryder, surrender the Zalari and you walk away. Refuse and your ship becomes scrap." Kira stiffened beside him, her silver eyes narrowing. Ethan's jaw tightened, his hand hovering over the comm controls. "What's the play?" she asked quietly. Ethan cut the transmission. "We run." The Raven surged forward, its engines roaring as Ethan steered them into a nearby asteroid field. The black ship followed, firing precise bursts that grazed their shields. The cabin rattled with each near miss, the tension mounting with every second. "Shields are holding," Kira said, her fingers flying over the co-pilot's controls. "For now." Ethan gritted his teeth. For now isn't good enough. He pushed the ship harder, weaving through the dense asteroid field with practiced skill. The jagged rocks loomed large, their edges glinting in the faint starlight. Each maneuver was a gamble, but Ethan trusted his instincts. The black ship wasn't as agile, its larger frame struggling to keep up. "They're slower, but their firepower's better," Ethan said. "If we get hit again, we're done." Kira's eyes closed briefly, her veins glowing brighter. "I can feel them." "What does that mean?" Ethan asked, glancing at her. "They're determined, but there's hesitation," she said, her voice calm but strained. "Like they're afraid of what happens if they fail." Ethan frowned. "Afraid of who?" "Their boss." Kira nodded. "Probably. It's not just about catching me. It's about delivering me." Ethan cursed under his breath. "Let's make sure they fail." The black ship fired again, a concentrated burst that slammed into the Raven's rear thrusters. The impact sent the ship lurching sideways, warning lights flashing across the console. "We've lost stabilizers," Kira said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Great," Ethan muttered. "Can you do something?" Kira hesitated, her glowing veins pulsing brighter. "If I try, I might." "Whatever you're thinking, do it," Ethan interrupted. "We don't have time." Kira's hands hovered over the controls, her focus narrowing. She closed her eyes, and a faint hum filled the cabin. The ship's systems flickered, then surged with new energy. The thrusters roared back to life, propelling the Raven forward with unexpected force. "What did you do?" Ethan asked, gripping the controls as the ship stabilized. "I rerouted energy from the life support systems," Kira said, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "We'll need to fix it soon." Ethan swore. "Let's hope we live long enough for that." The chase continued, but the Raven was gaining ground. Ethan fired back at the black ship, his shots grazing its shields but failing to do significant damage. Kira, her breathing shallow, focused her energy on keeping their systems functional. "They're charging weapons again," Kira said, her voice tight. "We can't take another hit." Ethan's mind raced, desperation clawing at him. "What else can you do?" Kira hesitated. "Something risky." "Risky how?" Ethan demanded. "I can disrupt their systems, but it'll drain me," she said. "I don't know how long I'll need to recover." Ethan's jaw tightened. He hated the idea of her putting herself in danger, but they were out of options. "Do it." Kira nodded, her glowing veins flaring as she closed her eyes. The hum returned, louder this time, resonating through the ship like a living force. A wave of energy rippled outward, invisible but palpable. The black ship faltered, its lights flickering as its systems struggled against the disruption. Ethan seized the opportunity, firing a direct shot that struck the enemy's engines. The black ship veered off course, its movements erratic as it retreated into the asteroid field. "We did it," Ethan said, exhaling sharply. Kira slumped in her seat, her veins dimming. "For now." Back in orbit, the silence felt deafening. Ethan turned to Kira, who looked pale and drained but resolute. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded weakly. "Just need to rest." Ethan stood, hesitating before placing a hand on her shoulder. "You saved us. Again." Kira looked up at him, her silver eyes soft but searching. "We saved each other." For a moment, neither of them moved. The weight of their survival, their connection, hung between them like an unspoken promise. Ethan's hand lingered, his thumb brushing her shoulder in a rare gesture of vulnerability. "Get some rest," he said finally, his voice quieter. Kira smiled faintly, her strength returning. "Don't brood too much while I'm gone." Ethan chuckled softly. "No promises." As she left the cockpit, Ethan leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. The enemy was still out there, and Kira's powers were both their greatest weapon and their greatest risk. Whatever came next, he knew one thing for certain: they were in this together, for better or worse. The cold expanse of the void stretched endlessly before them, the faint hum of the Raven's engines the only sound breaking the silence. Ethan sat in the cockpit, his eyes scanning the controls, though his thoughts were elsewhere. The black ship had retreated, but unease clung to him like smoke. He didn't trust easy victories, and he trusted their enemies even less. Kira entered quietly, her glowing green skin muted in the dim light. She had rested, but the strain from their escape lingered in the slight hitch of her step and the exhaustion lining her silver eyes. Even drained, she carried herself with a quiet strength that Ethan couldn't help but admire. "Status?" she asked, settling into the co-pilot's chair. "Engines are stable, shields are back at 50%, and we're heading for a nearby trade outpost," Ethan said, his tone brisk. "We need repairs and supplies." Kira studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "You're worried." "Not worried," Ethan replied, though the tension in his voice betrayed him. "Just cautious." "You should be," she said, leaning back in her chair. "They're not done with us." Ethan turned to her, his brow furrowing. "You sure?" Kira nodded. "I can feel it. They won't stop until they have me or until they're stopped." The trade outpost loomed in the distance, a sprawling station built into the remnants of an asteroid. Its mismatched metal structures and flickering lights spoke of its patchwork origins, a haven for drifters, smugglers, and those who preferred to stay off the radar. It wasn't Ethan's favorite kind of place, but it was safe enough to lay low, at least for now. As they docked, Ethan handed Kira a compact blaster. "Keep this on you." Kira arched an eyebrow, her silver eyes glinting with amusement. "Afraid I can't take care of myself?" Ethan smirked. "Afraid you might try to take care of me. Just keep it subtle." She accepted the weapon, tucking it into the waistband of her trousers. "Subtle isn't exactly my strength, but I'll try." Ethan opened the ship's hatch, the station's stale air rushing in. "Stay close." The station's interior was a labyrinth of narrow corridors, bustling markets, and dimly lit cantinas. Voices in a dozen languages filled the air, mingling with the clatter of machinery and the occasional shout of a heated negotiation. Kira stuck close to Ethan, her glowing skin drawing curious glances despite her best efforts to stay inconspicuous. "This place is chaotic," she murmured. "Welcome to the fringe," Ethan replied. "Rules are suggestions, and trust is a commodity." A gruff voice interrupted them. "Ethan Ryder. Never thought I'd see you again." Ethan turned to see a broad-shouldered man with a scar cutting across his cheek. The man's grin was more predatory than friendly, and Ethan tensed instinctively. "Corvin," Ethan said evenly. "Didn't think you'd still be hanging around here." "Could say the same about you," Corvin replied, his gaze flicking to Kira. "New partner." "Something like that," Ethan said, stepping slightly in front of her. Corvin's grin widened. "Interesting taste. You might want to be careful, though. Heard some rumors floating around. A Solari with glowing veins, valuable enough to make people do stupid things." Kira stiffened, but Ethan's expression remained neutral. "Rumors are dangerous, Corvin. Get too curious, and you might end up regretting it." Corvin laughed, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Relax, Ryder. Just making conversation. Good luck out there." As Corvin disappeared into the crowd, Kira exhaled slowly. "He knows." "Doesn't matter," Ethan said, steering her toward a quieter corner. "We'll be gone before he can do anything about it." Back on the ship, Kira paced the small cabin they shared, her glowing veins pulsing faintly with her agitation. "We can't keep running like this." "I know," Ethan said, leaning against the doorframe. "But we need to be smart about our next move." Kira stopped, her silver eyes locking onto his. "What's your plan?" Ethan hesitated. He had spent his life avoiding long-term plans, always staying one step ahead of trouble. But Kira was different. She made him think about things he had tried to bury, about purpose, loyalty, and the possibility of something more. "We find out who's after you," he said finally, "and we stop them." Kira frowned. "That's not a plan. That's a death wish." "Maybe," Ethan admitted. "But I'm not leaving you to deal with this alone." Her expression softened, and she stepped closer, her glowing skin casting faint patterns on his face. "Why are you doing this, Ethan? It's not just about saving me, is it?" Ethan met her gaze, his voice quiet but firm. "Because I care about you, and because I'm tired of running, too." For a moment, the weight of his words hung between them. Then Kira reached out, her hand resting lightly on his chest. "You're not alone anymore. Remember that." Ethan's breath hitched as her touch sent a ripple of warmth through him. Slowly, he leaned down, pressing his forehead to hers. "Neither are you." The next morning, Ethan found Kira in the cockpit, her silver eyes scanning the star charts. She looked up as he entered, a determined glint in her gaze. "I found something." "What?" Ethan asked, leaning over her shoulder. "A signal," she said, pointing to a faint blip on the map. "It's coming from a system not far from here. I think it might be a clue about who's after me." Ethan frowned. "Or it's a trap." "Probably," Kira agreed. "But we can't hide forever." Ethan studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Then let's spring the trap." As they set course for the signal, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were heading into something far bigger than either of them had anticipated. But with Kira by his side, he felt a strange, unfamiliar sense of hope. Whatever awaited them, they would face it together. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt like that might be enough.